Welcome to this computation of the biblical calendar using the sciences of astronomy and mathematics for the year 2020. This is a unique and simple way to compute the biblical calendar on a year-to-year basis. This is presented by www.144,000teachers.org. After Israel refused to enter Canaan, the Lord declares in Numbers chapter 14 verse 34, "And ye shall know my breach of promise," which means changing of my purpose. His purpose was for Israel to enter the promised land after the 40 days the spies were to return from the land of milk and honey. The 40 days were changed for 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. The Lord again expresses through Jeremiah his change of purpose for Israel. Instead of upholding his law, they rebelled against him, and this is what he declares in Lamentations chapter 2 verses 5 and 6, which is both applicable to the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple in 587 BC and the destruction of Jerusalem and the second temple in 70 AD. And we read, "The Lord was as an enemy. He hath swallowed up Israel. He hath swallowed up all her palaces. He has destroyed his strongholds, and he hath increased in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. And he has violently taken away his tabernacle as if it were of a garden. He hath destroyed his places of the assembly. The Lord hath caused the solemn feasts and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion, and has despised in the indignation of his anger the king and the priest." But a ray of hope is offered in the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 58 verses 12 to 14, which is a promise of repairing the breach of the sanctuary, the solemn assembly and Sabbath, which we see happening today with the biblical calendar. The biblical calendar being a Luni-Solar, Barley harvest, new moon on Crescent calendar with common and Embolismic intercalation, and the day being from sunset to sunset. And we read, "And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of past to dwell in. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father. For the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it." Step-by-step biblical calendar computation based on the properties of the biblical calendar. Step number 1, what you need in order to get started. Step number 2, what data to use to compute the biblical calendar. Step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar. Step number 4, how to reckon a calendar out of the data computed. Step number 5, how to reuse these steps year after year. Step number 6, how to compute an Embolismic year. Step number 7, what if you make a mistake computing the biblical calendar? As an introduction on how to get started, we read from Psalm chapter 119 verses 27 and 33, "Make me to understand the way of thy precepts, so shall I talk of thy wondrous works. Teach me, O Lord, the way of thy statutes, and I shall keep it unto the end." In Exodus chapter 3 verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, "Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Make sure to always prepare yourself with prayer and even fasting before you attempt to research the biblical calendar. You are learning how to compute the biblical calendar in order to worship the Creator of the universe at His appointed times. Make sure you follow the steps in the order they are presented, and please read or listen to the material suggested before moving forward. If you believe you are ready to pass to the first step, then let us get started, and may the Holy Spirit be with you. Step number 1, what you need to get started. The first step to get started is to watch the video on Standing on Trial for Your Beliefs, the Biblical Calendar, which is here on your left with the link at the bottom of the image. Please make sure to watch or listen to all the links added in the PowerPoint by going to the PDF, as you can only open the links in the PDF format. The PDF format is under the properties of the biblical calendar on your left here. Simply open 2 windows on your screen and listen or read the additional material when suggested on certain pages. Once you have listened and read the video and PDF, you are now prepared to take step number 2. Step number 2, which data to use to compute the biblical calendar. And remember, all our computations are made with the universal time. Please take note that if you experience problems opening the links with the PDF format, simply copy and paste them in Google search bar. Number 1, fraction illuminated of the moon for common or embolismic years. The first link is from the USNO, or the U.S. Naval Observatory, for the year 2020. The second link, again from the USNO, and this time is for the moon fraction of any year that you may be researching. Please remember, it's under universal time. The third link is from 144,000 teachers, where we have gathered the fraction of the moon illuminated for the years 2020 to 230, and this is under a PDF format that you can copy. Number 2, observatories' websites. The first link again is from the USNO, where we give you their opening page, and you can see different data for the moon phases of the moon or the fraction illuminated of the moon, and many other important information, such as even a link where you can observe what the moon looks like day by day. The second link, again from the USNO, is a very important page where you will want to study the moon phases if you're not familiar with them, plus additional links to bring you to other research. The third link is from Her Majesty Observatory with the program Moonwatch. This particular link is important, especially 3 weeks before the change to the conjunction again, where you will be able to see what the moon looks like. It's an observation one. The moon looks like all over the world when it is in conjunction, first visible crescent, or the horned crescent, which is the one that we use for computation. Number 3, the moon phases. Again, the first link is from the USNO, which this is the one we use particularly. And the moon phase is for any year that you choose. Again, always remember to select universal time. The second link from Her Majesty Observatory is also for moon phases, and it's a choice which link you prefer, from the USNO or from Her Majesty. We use the one from USNO usually, though the information are very, very similar, not too many difference in data. The third link is the 144,000teachers.org, offering you the phases of the moon for the years 2020 to 230 in PDF files, which you can copy. Number 4 is the Gregorian and Biblical months under a PDF file, offering you the months for the years 2018-2019, and also a video showing you how to understand better the biblical calendar. Step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar. This is the first part, again reminding you that our computation is based on universal time. The moon fraction illuminated for 2020 is presented here, as well as the moon phases observation and the moon phases calculation, again for the year 2020. The same links have been presented here for your reference. Again, the moon fraction illuminated from USNO. We have the moon phases observation from the USNO and Her Majesty Observatory, and the moon phases calculation from USNO. As we continue with the data, you will see what are those three basically chart for. It's not that complicated, and we will explain them as we get along. The first one on the left, the moon fraction illuminated, you will see many numbers which we will help you to understand. And of course, the moon observation, we are working with the horn crescent. We bypass the conjunction and the first visible crescent, and we always work with the horn crescent, which will be explained in shortly. And then the phases of the moon. These two we will explain to you how important it is, and always remember it's under universal time. Continuing with step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar. This is the second part, and remember the computation is always for universal time. We will be looking at an apparent discrepancy between the moon fraction illuminated and the moon phases calculation, specifically for the year 2020. However, this principle is applicable for any year that you choose to compute. The apparent discrepancy between the data of the fractions of the moon, such as presented on table number 1, on the left, and the 4 phases of the moon on table number 2 on your right, disappears when the hours of the moon are ascertained. If the conjunction, or the black moon for example, occurs between 0.1 to 10 hours, such as we will look at on table number 2, which is presented in gray, the dates for the conjunction will be the same as the fraction illuminated on table number 1. If, however, the phase occurs between 11 to 23 hours on table number 2 in yellow or green, the conjunction will be a day later. And this is 98% accurate for any given moon phase, time, date, and year. The 2% is the exception rather than the rule. Now let's look at an explanation on the table themselves to make it clearer. We will start with table number 2 with the phases of the moon, particularly here for 220, and of course with universal time. These data are given from the USNO. The new moon, which is the conjunction here in this case that we are looking at, and we will be looking at the full moon. We could be looking at the first quarter and the last quarter, but the conclusion are the same. Let's look at the new moon, the conjunction, which will be applicable for the full moon. First, we're going to be looking at the gray colors number. We're going to be starting with March 24th, which reads 9 hour and 28 minutes. April 23rd, 2 hour and 26 minutes. June 21st, 6 hour and 41 minutes. August 19, 2 hour and 42 minutes. November 15, 5 hours and 7 minutes. Let's pass now to the yellow color. January 24th, 21 hour and 42 minutes. February 23rd, 15 hours and 32 minutes. May 22nd, 17 hour and 39 minutes. July 20th, 17 hour and 33 minutes. September 17, 11th hour, October 16, 19 hours and 31 minutes, and December 14, 16 hours and 16 minutes. What you see here is that the number in gray are lower, as indicated earlier, from 0.1 to 10 hours, as shown in gray. This would be when the moon, which is always the conjunction, would be at a very, very early time, where with the yellow colors, you observe that those numbers are advanced time. They go from 11th hour all the way to 21:42. They go definitely much more advanced hour than with the gray colors. The same could be true of the full moon, so we will not go over those, but they're the same. They basically start, if you observe quickly, the gray colored number for the full moon, it starts April 8 at 2:35, and it basically goes all the way to 10 hours and 45 minutes for May 7. So basically, when you observe those colors, you can see that the gray is lower and the green is higher. The 1045s could have a variation slightly because it's very close to 11. So when you do the calculation with the fraction illuminated of the moon, then you will see what is confirmed here. So follow me carefully now to the table number 1. And we will start with the gray and yellow, having to do with the new moon conjunction. And we're going to be looking at a few months just to give you an insight as to how to read this. So let's go to the table number 1, where 0.00 is the conjunction and 1.00 is the full moon. And these do not need to be changed. They are basically observable here, except for a few exceptions like September, for example, which we will explain in a minute. But if you look generally, we're going to start with the gray color first. Let's look at March, April, then we have June, we have August, and we have November, which is identical to what we have on the moon phases, the table number 2. So we have March, April, June, August, and November. These are identical as far as where the dates are. If you check your dates, March 24th, April 23rd, and you will go down to June 21st, then August 19, then November 15. So these dates do not change according to the moon phases and the fraction. However, when we look now at the yellow colors, January 24th, February 23rd, May 22nd, July 20th, September 17, October 16, and December 14. This is not a discrepancy. That's what people call it, a discrepancy, because if you observe the 0.00 except for September, which we'll explain in a minute, the reason why, for example, January 24th at 21 hours and 42 minutes, that's what it shows on the moon phases. However, on the fraction illuminated of the moon, it shows it on the 25th. That is the adjustment that we are talking about because of the different hours. The earlier the hour, the exact amount for the moon phases, the exact date for the moon phases, and the fraction illuminated are the same. All those grays number, those gray color, you can notice that the dates are the same for both the fraction and the moon phase. However, with the yellow colors, because it's an advanced moon, it will overlap to the next day. And that's why this overlap is very well shown with the fraction illuminated of the moon. And there is no need to change anything. That's how the moon works. Now, which is the cycle of the moon. Now, for September, because we do not have 0.00, if you observe carefully, however, it's a yellow color. It's a yellow color corresponding to 11th hour. So rather than choosing the date of the September 17, it will come to the next day, September 18, and this is the one that will be used for calculation when we're ready to compute the calendar. This is the first homework you need to do for computation. This is exactly what we have done for you for the next 10 years. This is the PDF file that you can obtain from 144,000 teachers, and this has been done. We have done it specifically for the conjunction. We've done it here for the full moon as an example. Again, same exact thing happened. If you compare your dates of the gray colors, they will be right the same with the table number 1, number 2. However, when you go for the green color for the full moon, there will be a day later, and it's not a mistake, it's not a discrepancy, it's simply the cycle of the moon, whether it's an early hour of the night, of course, and then it goes on to the next day when it's a later hour. It changes from the next day. So basically, or the next night if you prefer, but basically this discrepancy is simply explained because of the early or the late hour of the moon. And this is what we wanted to show you in order for you to understand the next step now, the next part. This is the third part of step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar using the universal time for the moon fraction illuminated from the years 2020 to 2030 and the moon phases calculation for the years 2020 to 2030. We have prepared it for the new moon conjunction, and you can now compute the biblical calendar using the data that we have submitted to you in order to prepare the calendar for the next 10 years. Continuing with step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar, fourth part, and computing with the universal time, we will be using now as an example the moon fractions illuminated for 2020. Looking at the color description, we have now brought together the new moon conjunction in gray, the new moon conjunction in orange, which we have seen earlier. And we remember now that when we are talking about the moon conjunction, depending of the hours for the moon phases, this will definitely influence on the moon fraction illuminated that we read as far as the date. When the moon phases are in early hours, we know that the date on the fraction of the moon and the moon phases will be the same. For example, we have here the month of March and April, Gregorian reckoning for 2020 and other month following. They are showing in gray, which means when we read the moon phases and we read the moon fractions illuminated, they would be at the same date. The 24th of March is a conjunction at 0.00. The 23rd of April at 0.00, etc. When the moon phases are later, which means 11 hours and more, then the date will change when it's come time to compute the fraction of the moon illuminated, which we see here for January and February, for example, 2020 Gregorian reckoning. Though the moon phases are showing for January the 24th, they are computed with the fraction of the moon illuminated on the 25th at 0.00. The same with February, they will show on the 23rd for the moon phases, and yet the fraction of the moon is on the 24th. This is not an error, it's simply because we have made sure to ascertain the time properly, and this reading can be for the next 20 years ahead, always keeping the same principle for the new moon conjunction. Once the new moon is established for the conjunction, for its phase, we can now pass to the next phase, which is the visible crescent. As we use the month of January 2020 for an example, the conjunction is on the 25th at 0.00, and the first visible crescent is on the 26th at 0.01. Then the horn crescent, the sighting of the horn crescent, shows as being the 27th at 0.04, and the celebration of the new moon horn crescent will be on the 28th of January 2020 Gregorian reckoning at 0.09. So this explains the first three colors in gray, in yellow, orange, and red. So when we go and for the pink, which is again the beginning of a new month, which is the celebration of the new moon. As we pass now to the blue color with the 7-day Sabbath and the feast, there are quite a bit of them, and they always occur on the 7-day Sabbath, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th of the biblical month. This again is a principle that is very consistent, and it's a principle that repeats itself for whatever computation, whatever year you decide to do. And this is of course biblical, because many of the dates in the Bible, especially in Leviticus 23, correspond to those data of the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th. All of these Sabbaths right now are also combining with the feast. And those feasts, when we show, for example, we're going to look at one feast in particular to give you an example. In April the 10th, 2020, Gregorian reckoning, you see 0.95 UB. This is the unleavened bread feast, which is a Sabbath, but it also falls on the 7-day Sabbath. This occurs 3 times during the feast, and the next repetition will be in October the 4th with the first day of the Feast of Tabernacle at 0.96 in October on the 4th, and then the last day of Tabernacle, the 11th, will also be a 7-day Sabbath and a feast. We have now, as a next example of a feast, we will finish the 2 other colors of the brown and the green. The brown would be an example, April the 9th, Gregorian reckoning, which is the Passover, which is always the day after the full moon and not on it. You may want to go and study that video that we submitted earlier in this session that we recommended for you to study, because it explains all this. It gives you the reference where to understand this from. So we have the Passover, which is a feast, but you can do secular work on that day. So it's represented here with a kind of a brownish color, as well as the 11th of April, 2020 Gregorian reckoning, which corresponds to first fruit. So now we have 2 feasts where we can do secular work. They are not celebrated as a Sabbath, but they are a feast nevertheless. And now we have the color green, which is represented here with the first one on April the 16th for the last day of unleavened bread. June the 2nd, Gregorian reckoning, for the Feast of Pentecost, which is also kept as a Sabbath, following a Sabbath, but it is not on the Sabbath day, a 7th day. And also, this is Pentecost, and then the next one is September the 29th, where we have the Great Day of Atonement. We have definitely a lot of presentation of feast here, and it's quite exciting to see them developing right through this calendar. Then the last feast to be mentioned, and it's always a new moon, I should say, and it's the Feast of Trumpet in September the 20th. And it falls on a day of the moon, the new moon, where we do the new moon celebration. Not the new moon horn crescent itself, since the day from sunset to sunset that followed the sighting of the horn crescent. So this covers the Sabbath and the feast, and the only one that we need now to understand is the 7-day Sabbath, and in blue, but it has also red. This is involving the horn crescent. If you look, for example, and there is a few examples in this particular presentation of the fraction here of the moon, February the 25th is a case like this, where you have a new moon horn crescent sighting and a 7-day Sabbath. This would be a 29. This actually makes it a 29 day. When you see this, for example, in May is the same principle. On the 24th of May, Gregorian reckoning. On the 22nd of July is the same application. On the 19th of September is the same application of a 7-day Sabbath with a new moon horn crescent. It is not unusual. You have the same principle in November and December where you have blue and red. That's a 7-day Sabbath. That's a new moon horn crescent on the same day. And all of these days are 29 days. This does not change. It's the same principle throughout. So it's just a matter of getting used to it. And the way we have established it is by starting with the establishment of the conjunction. And then we look for the horn crescent. And then we establish the 7-day Sabbath. And of course, then we establish the feast. And everything comes together beautifully. And we can establish even the days, as you can see at the very last line, where it shows the days for every month. And of course, there is a rule where during the month of April to September, or usually it's the month of the feast, the spring feast, and the beginning of the fall feast, you should have always 177 days, which means you have to have 3 months of 30 days and 3 months of 29 days. This is not a man-made rule. It's actually the moon that established it by itself. And the 2020 is quite easier because it's a common year. If it was embolismic, there is a little bit more of principle to be applied. It's not complicated, but it's all based on principles. And these principles need to be respected. So this is basically, again, an example of what could be repeated when you do the computation of the biblical calendar. The fifth part for the step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar. We want to introduce now the moon fraction illuminated for 2020 as a common year with the Gregorian calendar for 2020. And the next step is to compute the data of the moon fraction illuminated to become part of the Gregorian calendar so it can be easy to convert from one to the other and understand that we are living with the Gregorian calendar in this day and age, and so we have to have something to relate to. So therefore, one sample way of computing to get started is we usually look at the Gregorian calendar months, and some corresponds where, for example, January, it starts on the Wednesday for the 1st of January Gregorian reckoning, and so is April, and so is July. Although they may not have the same amount of days in the month, this can be adjusted once we do the computing. And the same with February, which starts on a Saturday, so we look for August, which has also a Saturday, so which means we do not have to repeat those calendars all the time. We can simply copy and then readjust the data, and then we obtain again another month and changing simply the name of the months. We have done that for a number of years now, so therefore we have kept all these computation we have done, and we can go and borrow if we do not have them here with the month of, for example, if there is a month like March which starts on a Sunday, and if there is no repetition, which there is, as you can see, November is also on a Sunday. So this way you may end up with 12 months but only do about 4 or 5 because you just copy and then paste and then just jot those data around to do a computation for each month. And we will continue to show you in the next part how to proceed now with those data. Step number 4, how to reckon the biblical calendar out of the data computed. This is the 6th part, and this is the computation for the calendar for 2020, again using universal time. And this is the procedure that is actually to be repeated each time we compute a new month. We need the moon fractions illuminated, which have already been computed for 2020. And in order to do the month of January 2020, we will need the data of the fractions of the moon for December 2019. And the procedure is always the same. When you want to do the month of January, you need December. If you want to do February computation, you will need January computation, etc. The month of December 2019 for the fractions of the moon, are showing a color description in blue and red and pink. So the blue we know is the 7-day Sabbath, and if it is in the spring or in the fall, you will observe the computation carefully because you will have a feast, the spring feast and the fall feast. However, this is December and January, and there were no feasts in Israel, according to Leviticus 23, in the middle of the winter. So these blue numbers would be, the color blue would be for the 7-day Sabbath. The red is for the horn crescent, and the pink is for the celebration of the new moon. So therefore, as we proceed now, we will be looking at the 6th, the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th for the 7-day Sabbath, the 28th for the horn crescent, and the 29th for the celebration. And this is a 30-day month. As we now look at the month of December 2019, this is exactly what we are reading in the computation on the 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th of December, corresponding to the 8th, 15th, and 22nd, and 29th of the 9th biblical month. We have the 7-day Sabbath. And we have on the 29th of December 2019, the new moon for the 10th biblical month, which is the first of the 10th biblical month. The reason we know that the 7-day Sabbath are on the 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th is because of the computation of the fractions of the moon. But if we were to look at the month of November 2019, we would see that the new moon for November 2019 Gregorian reckoning occurred on a Friday. As we look at the full moon for December 2019 on the 12th, corresponding to the 14th of the 9th biblical month, we also have a conjunction on the 26th of December 2019 Gregorian reckoning, corresponding to the 28th of the 9th biblical month, and the horn crescent on the 28th of December 2019 Gregorian reckoning, corresponding to the 30th of the 9th biblical month. And now we are ready to compute January 2020. As we look at the 30th and 31st of December 2019, we have the 2nd and the 3rd day of the 10th biblical month. So for January 2020, we will be following with the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of the 10th biblical month, corresponding to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of January 2020. As we look at the fraction of the moon again, we have again blue numbers on the 5th, 12, 19, and the 26th of January 2020. And the red number is on the 27th of January 2020, Gregorian reckoning, and the celebration of the new moon would be on the 28th. And again, the month of January 2020, corresponding to the 10th biblical month, is a 30-day month. As we now compute on January 2020 Gregorian reckoning, these blue numbers, they fit perfectly with the 5th, 12, 19, and 26 of January 2020 Gregorian reckoning for the 8th, 15, 22nd, and 29 of the 10th biblical month being 7-day Sabbath. And we have on the 11th of January 2020 the full moon, corresponding to the 14th of the 10th biblical month. On the 25th of January 2020, we have a conjunction corresponding to the 28th of the 10th biblical month, and the horn crescent is on the 27th of January 2020, Gregorian reckoning, corresponding to the 30th of the 10th biblical month, which change over at sunset for the new moon of the 11th biblical month, being the first of the month. And it follows with on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of January 2020 Gregorian reckoning with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of the 11th biblical month. And both December 2019 is part of a common year, as well as January 2020, as they follow each other in the month. And this belongs to the year that precedes now, the new year that is coming up, with the 12th and the 1st biblical months in January, February, March, and as you follow with the Gregorian reckoning. And this is the way to compute month by month using the data of the fractions of the moon that we have already computed. Continuing with step number 4, how to reckon the biblical calendar out of the data computed. This is the 7th part for the computation of the year 2020 based on universal time. The biblical calendar for the year 2020, Gregorian reckoning, is a common year, and the data are taken from the moon fractions illuminated for 2020. What we will be looking at first is the numbers of days per month. And you have here the month of January 2020 Gregorian reckoning, and it corresponds to the 10th biblical month and the beginning of the 11th biblical month. For the 10th biblical month, we have 30 days. In February, this is the 11th biblical month, 29 days. In March, for the 12th biblical month is 30 days. In April, for the 1st biblical month is 30 days. May corresponds to the 2nd month of 29 days. And as you continue to read month by month, first the Gregorian reckoning and then the month itself, the biblical month, the 3rd month, for example, for June has 30 days. And you will see that every month can be either 30 or 29 days. Now, how do we compute that 29 or 30 days? It has to do with the cycle of the moon. It is not man-made or man-addition. And to give you an example, let's return to the 10th biblical month in January 2020 Gregorian reckoning. If you look carefully, and we will be getting accustomed to speak biblical month rather than Gregorian reckoning. So for the month of January 2020 Gregorian reckoning corresponding to the 10th biblical month, on the 29th of the 10th biblical month, the last 7-day Sabbath, there is a 30-day in between that particular month to the next month, which is the new moon of the 11th biblical month, which is to be celebrated on the 28th of January 2020. So as you can observe, between the 29th of the 10th biblical month and the 1st of the 11th biblical month, there is a 30-day there. So that makes it a 30-day month. Now, for the month of the 11th biblical month, that we find in February 2020 Gregorian reckoning, between the 29th, which is the last 7-day Sabbath, and the 1st new moon of the 12 biblical months, we have here 29 days. There is no 30 days in between, so it makes it a month of 29 days. And then you can continue like this, looking at the month of March Gregorian reckoning. Again, the same principle occurs. You look at the 29th of the 12th biblical month, passing to the 1st of the 1st biblical month, there is a 30-day there. So it makes it a 30-day month, etc., etc. So it's a good exercise if you continue to do every month, looking at them and seeing that there is already a given number for each month. You will be able then to comprehend the principle here, which is what you continue to compute month by month, year by year, and establishing the number of days for each month. There are a few pointers that you need to look at. Let's look at the month of April 2020 Gregorian reckoning, which is the first month of the new year. The new moon was shown in March 2020, as we saw there. The new moon was on the 27th of March 2020. And this is the new moon for the first month, the new year. And on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of the first biblical month, in the month of April, you will find on the 14th of the first biblical month, which we at times call Abib, which means the barley is ripened, is the feast of Passover. The feast of Passover is always on the 14th of the first month, corresponding to the day after the full moon. And the full moon for April 2020 is on the 8th of April. And then follows the Passover, which is not a Sabbath. It's a feast, but it is not a Sabbath. There is work that can be done on the feast of Passover. And then it's followed by the feast of unleavened bread, corresponding to the 10th of April, Gregorian reckoning, and corresponding to the 15th of the first month for the first day of unleavened bread. Then it's followed on the 16th of the first month with the Feast of First Fruit, which, like Passover, is a feast, but we can do secular work on that day. Then we go to the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is corresponding to the 21st of the month, the first month. And this is not a day that comes at the same time as a 7-day Sabbath, like the first day of unleavened bread. So it's a Sabbath on its own, which makes it 2 Sabbaths in a row. They are kept as Sabbath. So when we keep the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which here we see is corresponding to the 21st of the first month, then this is a Sabbath, followed by the 22nd of the first month, which is a 7-day Sabbath. So when you see an extra square, you could say, blue square, this is not the beginning of another month. It's usually a feast day. Then for the same practice run, we're going to look at the month of June to have a better idea of what we're talking about here. We have a perfect example on the 8th of the third month. It is followed by, this is biblical month, of course, it is followed by the 9th of the third biblical month with the Feast of Pentecost, which corresponds to the 2nd of June, Gregorian reckoning. So this is not, again, the beginning of a new month. It's a holy convocation, a holy day, which does not happen to occur on a 7-day Sabbath. So it makes it like 2 Sabbaths in a row. The same occurs also if you look at the month of September with the beginning of the fall feast. So these were the spring feasts. Now we're passing to the fall feast. And you will see again the same. In September, you have the 6 months, which finishes with the 29th of the 6 months, which is a 7-day Sabbath, passing to the first day of the 7th month. And you look at this in the month of September, and we're getting accustomed to talk biblical month here. So look at the blue boxes, if you may. And then you have the 8th of the 7th biblical month, which corresponds here to the 27th of September, 2020. And then passing through this, you will obtain then the 10th of the 7th biblical month, which is the Day of Atonement, corresponding to the 29th of September 2020. So this is not, again, that extra box is not a month starting again. It's simply a feast that does not occur on a 7-day Sabbath, and it's basically the Day of Atonement. We have also the Feast of Trumpet, which we see on the new moon of the 7th month, which occurred here in September. And again, it is not a 7-day Sabbath. The new moon is not a 7-day Sabbath, but it's a Sabbath on its own and corresponding to the Feast of Trumpet for the 7th month. So this is the only new moon that has a feast, a monthly feast on it, and it's the 7th month. So as you can see, it's quite simple once you get accustomed to talk biblical calendar, that these have definitely a continuity. Of course, the month of the 7th month has 30 days, as you can see as you follow through with the month of October 2020 Gregorian reckoning. Look at the 29th of the 7th month, which is celebrated on a Sunday that year, Gregorian reckoning. And then it follows with the 30-day there in between. And then it starts again with the new moon on the first of the 8th biblical month. And this again makes it a 30-day. So that's how you can come to recognize the 7-day Sabbath, the 29 or the 30-day of the month, and the celebration for the feast, which are additional Sabbaths. Now, as we look at another important rule here, it's a principle, and it's established by the moon itself. It is not man-made. This is the 170 days between the Passover month to the trumpet month, 3 months of 30 days and 3 months of 29 days. So if you were to look attentively, you would see that it does correspond to 3 months of 30 days and 3 months of 29 days between the Passover month, which in this case was the month starting with March, April, and then it goes all the way to September, October. So you do not count necessarily the month of the 7th month. It's 6 months that you see those days, and it always occurs like that year after year if you have computed your calendar properly. And this computation for the calendar, we have done the moon fraction eliminated from 2020 to 2030 and has given you the link for it on this computation. So therefore you can continue to practice on your own to do computation for at least the next 10 years. So this is the computation for the biblical calendar and the reckoning of the biblical calendar for 2020 corresponding to the biblical calendar, of course, and it is a common year. Continuing with step number 4, how to reckon the biblical calendar out of the data computed. This is the 8th part, and we will be enunciating the universal laws or principle of the biblical calendar, as well as illustrating these laws with the physical laws of applied sciences through astronomy and mathematics, as we have done all along. We will be looking specifically at the 8, 15, 22nd, and 29 days, as well as biblical months of 29 days and 30 days, along with the new moon, which always starts a new month. Let's look at the biblical months of 29 and 30 days as we have now established through the computation of the months. Specifically here, we will compare it with 2 months, the months of January and February 2020 Gregorian reckoning. The month of January 2020 corresponds to the 10th and 11th biblical months, as well as February, the 11th and the 12th biblical months. And as we look at the 29th of the 10th biblical month, in the month of January 2020 Gregorian reckoning, we can see that in between the 29th and the 1st, which is the new moon for the 11th biblical month, there is a 30-day there. So this is how we compute it. It's following the moon itself, which establishes it specifically with the horn crescent. Wherever the horn crescent is situated, this will define your numbers of days for the month. So in the case of the 10th month, we have 30 days. And then if we pass to the next month, the 11th month, and the description of it even more is computed in February 2020 with the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of the month. And here we have a 29 day. The horn crescent is basically found on the 29th day of the 11th month. And then it defines the 12 biblical months as being now followed with the first and the new moon at the same time. And in between, as you can see, between the 29 and the first, there is no 30 days. So therefore, this is a 29 day. And this is how you compute again for the number of days per month. Every month can be computed this way. And then, of course, remember the new moon is always establishing the new month or the beginning of another month. And another principle that is definitely enunciated here very clearly is that the Sabbath days are always on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th day of the month. So there is no dispute here. For now, we have done a computation for 12 months, and this is repeated over and over and over. 3 principles: the 29 or the 30 days, the new moon being the new month, and the Sabbath days always being on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. And of course, here we have not looked again at the feasts, but the feasts are also established in Leviticus 23. And though they do not occur all the time on the same Gregorian day every year, because they depend totally on the cycle of the sun and the moon and not just the sun, so therefore they will vary when compared to the Gregorian reckoning. However, when it's compared between biblical months, they are actually totally an enunciation of principles which can be illustrated year by year, and they always correspond very well. Now, if we look at the image on the left side, the Luni-Solar monthly calendar, you will see this is how it established itself for a month of 29 or 30 days. And the new moon always starts the monthly cycle on the first day of each month. And although it is a Sabbath, it is not considered a 7-day Sabbath. And the 7-day Sabbaths are the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of each month. So these are called universal laws or universal principles that are enunciated through the biblical calendar and illustrated through the physical laws of applied sciences, of astronomy, and mathematics. Step number 5, how to reuse these steps year after year. The biblical calendar is always computed on universal time using the data of moon fractions illuminated, which confirms the moon phases calculation, and then we use the moon phases observation to basically, as a second witness, confirm our calculation. Once the moon fractions illuminated have been computed month by month, we are ready now to reckon the biblical calendar on the Gregorian calendar. The links for the observatories to be used are again submitted here, as well as in the table of reference in the last page of this presentation. Continuing with step number 5, how to reuse these steps year after year. The first step is what you need in order to get started. What you need is to listen to the video again on the properties of the biblical calendar, which are universal laws of a Luni-Solar, Barley harvest, new moon on Crescent Calendation with common and Embolismic year where an intercalation is added, and the day running from sunset to sunset. Step number 2, what data to use to compute the biblical calendar. The biblical calendar is based on universal time, and we need the data of the moon fractions illuminated, the moon phases observation, the moon phases calculation data, and a Gregorian calendar for that particular year that we intend to compute. Step number 3, how to use the data to compute the biblical calendar is by having the moon fractions illuminated data for that particular year, which always confirms the moon phases calculation when compare one with the other, and then the moon phases observation every month in order to use as a second witness for the calculation of the calendar, and then the Gregorian calendar on which to reckon those data. Step number 4, how to reckon a calendar out of the data computed is by now using those moon fractions illuminated data that we have prepared in advance for the year that we intend to compute, and now transfer them to the Gregorian calendar, and now that's how we obtain the biblical calendar. Step number 6, how to compute an embolismic year. We are comparing now the 2020 common year with the year 2021, which is an embolismic year. The solar cycle of 365 days per year and the lunar cycle of 354 days per year makes a difference of 11 days between the two cycles. This difference is made up by the moon every 2 to 3 years by adding 1 month to the 12th month, which is called an intercalation. To compute a common or embolismic year using the moon fractions illuminated, look at the position of the full moon for the month of April, Gregorian reckoning, at 1.00. The Passover on Abib 14, Abib meaning barley is ripe, is the day following the full moon. Barley ripens in Israel the second week of April, around the 8th of April, and if the full moon is earlier, postpone the Passover to the next day after the next full moon, as in the case of 2020 versus 2021. As we look at the fractions illuminated of the moon for the year 2020, which is a common year, let's take a look at the full moon at 1.00 in April. This can be seen as the 8th of April, Gregorian reckoning for 1.00, and the day following on the 9th of April at 0.99. This is the Passover. As we look at 2021, which is an embolismic year, the earliest full moon in April is on the 27th of April, Gregorian reckoning, making the Passover the day after on the 28th of April as the day of the Feast of Passover, announcing the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It is not too late in the season. It is late when you compare it with the Gregorian reckoning. However, according to the biblical cycle of the moon and the sun, this is actually typical of an embolismic year. If you want to know further about the fraction of the moon illuminated and also an indication of each year being either common or embolismic year, please make sure to visit the PDF file that is submitted here, which is found in the 144,000teachers.org website. Step number 7. What if you make a mistake computing the biblical calendar? Repairing the breach after 2,000 years. Following the events of 1798, which marked the end of the Dark Ages and of the First Papal Supremacy, a renewed study of the biblical calendar can be traced back to the Millerites movement in the 1840 era, mainly led by Baptist and Methodist ministers and lay people. They believed that Christ was returning to the earth according to the 2300 days of years prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14. Though the Millerites erred according to the event, their computation of the biblical calendar was based on the Karaites, which rose against the rabbinical Jew alterations of the biblical calendar around the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and through the Dark Ages. We have actually been living close to 2,000 years on false biblical calendaric computation. After the Great Disappointment of 1844, the date of October 22nd, 1844, was retained by the Seventh-day Adventist Church as the Great Day of Atonement of Leviticus 23, as confirmed by their study on the heavenly sanctuary. But the pioneers started observing the seventh-day Sabbath according to the Gregorian calendar reckoning in 1845, and Seventh-day Adventists have done so ever since. A renewed interest in the biblical calendar arose around 1939, 1995, and 2005, and it has opened an array of speculations as to what is the true biblical calendar. In fact, numerous sites on the internet witness to this fact, and few agree with each other. The biblical calendar is computed through biblical, astronomical, archaeological, chronological, historical, and spirit of prophecy data, and requires much prayer, studies, and perseverance. Because the biblical calendar is based on observation and calculation, it is possible, by upholding the properties of the biblical calendar, to correct a mistake after computing it, especially if you ascertain the biblical calendar for a whole year in advance and more, instead of relying on a month-to-month reckoning. The computed biblical calendar is based on these properties of the biblical calendar: Luni-Solar, Barley harvest, new moon on Crescent Calendation, with a common and Embolismic year, and the day running from sunset to sunset. The Great Controversy, page 582, we read, "In seeking to cast contempt upon the divine statutes, Satan has perverted the doctrines of the Bible, and errors have thus become incorporated into the faith of thousands who profess to believe the Scriptures. The last great conflict between truth and error is but the final struggle of the long-standing controversy concerning the law of God. Upon this battle we are now entering, a battle between the laws of men and the precepts of Jehovah, between the religion of the Bible and the religion of fable and tradition." Jesus in John 8:32 tells us, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." The table of references contains most of the links that have been submitted during this computation of the biblical calendar presentation.